Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, in the interest of time, I'll begin the webinar and hopefully more viewers will join along the way. So, good evening again and welcome to this webinar hosted by Azim Premji University, Bangalore. My name is Neelima and I'm an MA graduate from the development program at APU. And currently, I'm managing the iThink Bio project for the Bio faculty at the School of Science and Arts at APU. So, welcome again. Today, we'll be discussing the status of biology education in India. What are the pressing needs and concerns of bioeducation in India? Um, as teachers in high schools and undergraduate programs, how do we go forward? What are the best approaches to teaching biology in a context like India? Professor Shashidhara will join us from Ashoka University to discuss these things. He'll also share with us his own experiences teaching biology and engaging with students of biology. Uh, some of the faculty at APU recently developed and launched their own undergraduate textbook called iThink Biology. So we have two of the authors of the book here with us, Professors Shravanti Upaluri and Professor Kaustubh Rao. So they're here to share with us a little bit more about the book, introduce us to it, share with us a few of its features, and even tell us really what motivated them to develop the book in the first place. So, without waiting for longer, I will invite Professor Shravanti Upaluri to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Shravanti teaches various bio courses at APU, such as cell and developmental biology, biophysics, molecular biology, etc. Shravanti, over to you.
Thanks, Nilima. I want to start by welcoming our audience today, and of course, want to begin the session by welcoming Professor Shashidhara. So, just a very brief introduction on his background. There's a long list of achievements, but I'll keep it brief. So, Professor Shashidhara is a distinguished professor at Ashoka University right now. He's on lien from the Indian Institute for Science Education and Research from Pune. He has also worked at CCMB in Hyderabad. Broadly, his interests are in developmental biology. He's used Drosophila, the fruit fly, to study organ growth and development. His background, he's done his bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Agricultural Sciences in Dharwad. And then he's gone on to get his PhD from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Shashi has really been recognized for his scientific contributions through numerous awards from the CSIR Technology and SS Bhatnagar Prizes, the J.C. Bose National Research Fellowship, and the list goes on and on. But really, the reason that he's here, and we're very excited to have him here, is that he's been a real champion for science education. He served on many government committees that deal with education, basic, applied, translational, and research funding, innovation, policy, outreach, and so on. And perhaps the most, at least in my mind, exciting of his contributions is that he's been working on training more than 10,000 school and undergraduate teachers in adopting inquiry-based teaching methods. Besides this long list, the real reason I am very, very excited about having Professor Shashidhara here is I was actually attended one of his talks that he gave in December 2019, over 2 years ago now. And I actually took a photograph of the slide that he had put up because it resonated so much with the work that we had been doing at the time. And I still have that photograph. And on that slide, he said there's an urgent need for inquiry-based learning education programs in undergraduate programs, that there's a serious need to pay attention to pedagogy, so teaching and learning, and that serious attention had to be paid to training teachers. So all three of these points were extremely relevant to the work that we were doing at Azim Premji University, and especially resonated with the work that we had already begun while working on this textbook, iThink Biology. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Shashidhara to discuss these ideas a little bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Shravanti. Thanks for your kind introduction. I don't think I deserve so much to be talked about. I'm very happy to be here. In fact, my first seminar, or now it's called webinar, obviously, because everything is online, to Azim Premji University, an university which I always admired for what it stands for and what the kind of faculty you already have. And thanks to you, and I know of course, from his NCBS days, you people are doing fantastic work. And Divya is another colleague whom I know very well. Particularly, I think what sort of resonates well is the what you want to do. That is change the future of education, increase the understanding of the concept rather than the details. Second is your commitment in biology to ecology and evolution, which is, whether you want to work on vaccine or whether you want to work on biodiversity. I think ecology and evolution both are, equally important, which I'm going to sort of touch upon in my talk today. So very often we have a misunderstanding, more so in India than any other place, that ecology evolution is for people who work on tigers and lions, or perhaps on forest ecosystem, and not for those who want to do molecular biology in the lab or biomedical research. Um, you know, uh, and the current pandemic has sort of given sufficient lesson that to understand a pandemic, you need to have good understanding of ecology and evolution. And ecology is not simply about forest. Ecology is about interaction between living organisms. And pandemic is all about interaction between not just virus and its host, it's also between hosts, right? All these COVID, what we call COVID appropriate behavior we keep talking about in the epidemiological context, it's about interaction of individuals who are all living organisms and how do they interact with each other. Of course, there is a cultural connotation, how we behave and how we interact with each other. But beyond that, there is also a biology aspect to it. How many of us are immunologically resistant to the virus? How many of us are susceptible? How many of us spread the virus at much faster rate compared to others who may spread at a lower pace? In addition, of course, viral variant itself has its own features. Today we have, talking about as we speak, only yesterday Bangalore detected two cases of Omicron variant, which people think may spread faster than Delta variant. But it doesn't mean that it's universally it is the same. It may be spreading faster than Delta variant in South Africa, given its geoclimatic and genetic nutrition, immunological background of the people, and also the fact that the less number of people are vaccinated. Does it behave exactly the same way in India? Of course, we need to understand. It may or may not. I'm not going to say that it's not going to behave the same way. But that's what ecology is all about, right? Understanding the complex network of interactions between organisms in varied different contexts, and no one particular context is sort of applicable to the university. So, in that reason why we need to change the way understand biology, the way teach biology, right? So teachers need to understand biology in its true sense, and that's then it's easy for them to teach. And the modern technology, digital technology, and very different digital resources we have, and the real life example that we take, whether it is the current pandemic, or for example, a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, if I'm correct, in the Gir forest, large number of lions died of some infection, right? And it became a big news, national news, because the pride of India, these lions, and succumbing to some infectious diseases, it became a big news. Understanding that one to understanding the cancer, or understanding human cognition, consciousness, whatever the topic you take, you need to have a better clarity of some of the basic concepts of biology. So maybe what I'll do is, I'll, rather than rambling, somewhat disconnected way. That's how we teach biology, unfortunately, in India, where the biology is so disconnected, considering it's very complex, and but still is a continuum. Let me share my slides and use the slides as a prompt for myself, my thought processes to connect biology the way it should be taught. Can someone share my slides, please? Okay, maybe we'll start with the very first slide, the previous one, which has the title slide. Yeah. So when you're talking about the status of biology education in India, which is the theme of this webinar, it's not very different from rest of the world. Biology is as disconnected or broken in most part of the world as we have in India. Perhaps still some, part of. Sorry, I think I'll don't move the slide unless I ask for it. Okay. If you go back to the previous one. Um, so it is also true that in many other parts of the world also the biology is not taught in a desirable way, and but there is opportunities for students to experience the you know the research in the laboratories, even at the school level sometimes, and definitely at the undergraduate level. Somehow that will make up for the loss of the better understanding of biology in the classroom level, because in India, the education is mostly at the classroom level. It's mostly taught in the classrooms by the teachers, particularly at the school and undergraduate level. We need to change the way we teach, because the students otherwise will end up, going without a clear understanding of biology. The next slide, please. So, your book, sorry, previous one. The book is iThink Biology. That's what you are going to launch, the online book. And I think that phrase is really, really, has been used again and again by many scientists. And Darwin's notebook, in which he, spoke about his idea about theory of evolution and how the variations are generated, and then organisms get selected, and then there's a continuously branching out to new forms and new species. At that time we were talking about, and that sort of, the notebook starts with I think, and many scientists, students, and the corporate people also start sometimes imitating. So many times they start writing in their notebook, they start with I think. Many times it stops at that point without going beyond the two word I think. Anyway, uh, I think I think the biology has to be taught the way Darwin thought about it, and, and perhaps there are not necessarily all aspects of Darwinian understanding of biology, because the understanding of biology is much better now, and many of the concepts that Darwin were talking about are actually proven to be wrong. But largely, the connectivity of all aspects of biology, starting from very origin of life until today, and then how we interact with ourselves, how our organs interact with each other, how our cells interact with each other, how our brain is connected to rest of the body. Everything has to be looked into in the context of evolution, right? So that's the very premise on which the biology should be taught, because no other way you can get a better understanding of biology other than in the context of evolution, right? I'll come to the famous phrase of Dobzhansky about that later. The next slide, please. So just to tell you why it's important, because very often, without a better alternate, often we try to explain things based on our own perception. But our perception is always biased, because our perception is based on our own sensory organs and our limitation of our brain. But the world is beyond our perception. The real world is beyond our perception, right? And in the absence of personal understanding of science and scientific, concepts, you cannot teach in the classroom simply by reading out from a textbook without its conceptual understanding, and only based on your perceptual understanding, because our perceptual understanding can be always biased, and it's not subjective, and in that, it is subjective, it is not objective. So in that context, scientific methods are very important, not only to discover something new. Scientific methods are important even to understand what is already known, and scientific methods are important to teach someone else the real concept, right? So it's that's why the for self understanding or self learning by teachers, because not everything is written in the textbook is understandable. and our own learning is 20 years. For example, I learned biology, more than 40 years ago. I started learning genetics, and today we know so much about genes and gene expression, right? And many things have changed our conceptual understanding, right? And obviously we need to keep on learning, right? As a teacher, I need to keep on learning. Then I had to use scientific methods to learn. Otherwise, I'll never be able to understand biology in a proper way. Next slide, please. And we all should realize, unlike olden time, unlike the way we learned biology, unlike the way current even the textbooks are written, biology is a continuum of physical and chemical world, right? Why am I calling this? We all know, you know, it's sort of, you know, in a very discrete way, in a very disconnected way, we all know that an electron or a photon or an atom, a hydrogen or oxygen in our body would behave exactly the same way anywhere else in the universe. We know our biological world obeys all laws of physics, right? But at the same time, we still consider biological world very different. Of course, it has different properties. I'll come to that in a minute. But it is still a continuum of physical world. But the same physical world first continues to become a chemical world and then to the biological world. So obviously, you may ask, what is chemical world versus the physical world? One can go on discussing that at length later. Just give you one simple example: is the basic physical properties of matter, right? When they sort of forms these chemical molecules. For example, hydrogen is an atom, oxygen is another atom, H2O is a chemical entity, which basically is a molecule which is, product of a combination of a reaction between two individual atoms. But it has its own properties. But it also has certain physical properties. That physical property may change at certain state. For example, a single H2O, the physical properties of H2O is different than a collection of H2O molecules, because water, all these physical properties come from a slightly different context. So as you can see here, the emergent property of a chemical world would be more complex compared to the basic ingredients provided by the physical world, although they all obey laws of physics at the ground level. The emergent properties of multiple molecules when they talk to each other, when the biological world emerges, it's obviously even more complex. It's so complex that obviously, as I mentioned here, it's almost even imagined to, conceptualize the scale of complexity, right? And so let's not even talk about that. That could be more philosophical and perhaps even a mathematical question. Today, I'll not discuss that part. Next slide, please. Obviously, how do you understand such a biological world, or what is life? Because understanding biology is not something what is written in the textbook. Biology is all about life itself. Biology about myself, biology about my neighbor, my family member. Biology is about what is the outside. We see a plant or a tree or an insect or a mosquito which comes and bites me, or a housefly which is maybe flying around my head now, right? All of these things is biology, the way we are trying to understand the life, okay? And that should be the premise to teach biology, because if you start saying that biology is about organization of petals and sepals in a flower, or organization of very different features on the head segment of of a worm or an insect, that's really not the way to teach biology. Biology is to start saying that it is nothing but trying to understand the life, but because it's so complex, we'll piece together in a systematic way. So we learn in a modular way. We may learn a bit of botany, we may a bit of zoology, but we should not separate botany and zoology as two distinct, fields. They're just simply two parts of the same living system. The next slide, please. So, for example, how do you teach genetics? All of you have learned genetics the way it is written in most of our textbook. It simply say, oh, Mendel did some experiment and he observed that, the dominant recessive phenotypic ratio is 3:1, or if it is, at that time he inferred genotypic ratio, which is 1:2:1, or he, two hybrid ratio, he said 9:3:1, and at the phenotypic level and so forth. But is it all? But genetics is about inheritance of traits. But because he used morphologically distinct features, that, like in this case, the color of the flower, or height of the plant, or the shape of the seed, or the color of the seed, or whatever. But what he was trying to understand is not simply some morphological features which are apparent from outside. It is the life itself. What is being inherited is the life, all properties of life. Finally, what comes out from a pea plant is another pea plant. What comes from a two human couple is another human life, right? So what we are inheriting is all aspects of life, not simply a few features like your eye color, or shape of the nose, and so forth. And genetics has to be thought that way. It is what are we inheriting? We're inheriting basically certain, of course we had to come to the physical basis of inheritance later, but in a way, what conceptually it is inheritance of the life itself. So in a way, the genetic program that basically brings about another individual to the earth, and how that is sort of born and how it develops, right? And that's how the genetics should be taught, rather than simply very sort of without connecting to other aspects of life, right? In fact, to an extent, why particularly in the context of today's topic, it's the botany teachers to teach genetics in a different way than the zoology teachers and the human genetics people, right? Genetics is not considered as a universal topic which has universal application. The laws of inheritance are exactly the same way from bacteria to human. Although bacteria is haploid, they still follow Mendelian genetics, and we all follow Mendelian genetics. There is something called non-Mendelian genetics. It's simply because Mendel didn't know certain aspects of genetics, so we call it that as non-Mendelian genetics. There's nothing like Mendelian, non-Mendelian genetics. It's simply genetics, right? Whether it's the mitochondrial version or the nuclear DNA, or whatever, right? So genetics have to be taught again, how characters, which basically represent the entire life, are inherited generation after generation with certain levels of, or highest, not certain, very high degree of fidelity. If there are 7 billion people on this earth, born to whatever the number of couples, all of them are human beings. And the chances that a human, couple that will go into another human being is 100% as of now, right? There can be variations at the population level, at the sibling levels, but those variations are so small. Our inheritance is more about the inheritance of true type, rather than inheritance of small variations. In fact, the way we teach genetics in this country is very often people look for what is the probability that you will get a recessive phenotype, what is the probability that a particular allelic frequency is this much in a given population. We are always looking for a small variation in the population. We forget that genetics is all about trying to understand how do we get that 99.99% high degree of fidelity when organisms are born every generation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I have already spoken about it. So next slide, please. So again, just to what Mendel was trying to, was it's not simply about inheritance of a few characters here and there, and trying to identify what is the probability of a particular phenotype in the population. It's about how we inherited the all aspects of life itself, and at the same time also generate certain kinds of diversity. And that diversity is what, of course, later when the modern synthesis happened, when Mendelian genetics and Darwinian theory of evolution was combined, gave a fantastic understanding of biological world. The next slide, please. So what Darwin was proposing was the why are we so, although everybody was talking about certain aspects of biology, morphological similarities, what's the differences? Now, Darwin was trying to connect the both, right? Certain taxonomists were looking at how do we classify organisms based on the differences. There are taxonomists who also were on those days called naturalists, for example, Buffon, one of the greatest naturalists of 16th century in France. And they're also looking for what is common between us and chimpanzees, or between chimpanzee and other apes, or between mammals and birds and so forth. But there are people who are also looking for what is the difference, so that we can claim that we are different from others, or this animal is different from other animals and so forth. And Darwin was trying to sort of connect the two and looking for a continuum in life, all the way from all living organisms. Of course, by the time the fossil evidence of past extinct species was already well known, so he was also trying to connect the current existing species with the one which all had already become extinct. So in a way, Darwin was the first one to synthesize both the similarities and differences as part of one process, which he called as evolution. The next slide, please. And now we know, with sufficient mathematical and statistical evidence and experimental evidence in genetics, population genetics, and so forth, that the so-called natural selection, which Darwin spoke about, is not an active goal-oriented process. Rather, it is a passive process. It's an outcome. It's a statistical outcome, what we call as natural selection. Selection is not an active process. Okay, I want to select something. Instead, after something has happened, you look back and say something is now more at present at a higher frequency than in the previous generation, a particular, let's say, variation, a particular allele. Then you call it as it is selected. Who selected? No one has selected that. It simply happens to be at a higher frequency. Of course, there are certain boundary conditions why it is at a higher frequency that you consider as ecological context. And that selection pressure or ecological context, or some narrow filtering process, which basically has made one particular variant at higher frequency, and we say that it is selected. That process Darwin called natural selection. Even the word survival of the fittest, nature selects, these are the kind of words generally we use, even teachers use in the classroom, which gives a wrong impression about what is evolution or what is biology, which is something which you have to come out. Many times it's a language which becomes a barrier for us, right? So many of the concepts, obviously, it has come from the Western countries, discovered by other people, written first time in English, and then when it's translated to Indian English or to our own language of our brain, or to our other spoken language like Hindi or Kannada or something, we actually get a misunderstanding of these concepts. So something that is very important, that this particular slide I'm showing you, it's very important to understand many aspects of biology, and also to connect relation between human and rest of the living organisms, between us and our pathogens, between us and our pollinators. It's very important. This statement is for you to get a real understanding. Tomorrow, your students may become whatever they want to become. They may not even pursue biology in their life. They may want to do research in biology. They may want to go back to their farming. They may want to do some other business. But in a real understanding of life, and for them to have a good ecological understanding of our diversity, and the importance of mitigating the climate change, importance of having a sustainable living, so that not only you live happily and everybody else live happily. It's not about one person's one. It's important to know what is that, what's the position of humans in this entire biological world. And we always ascribed ourselves a special position because we are selected. That's what we always assume. Even if you consider as it is not the God someone else has selected, there is no, let's say if you are an atheist, even many atheists think that nature has selected us because there is a purpose for all of these things. I think that's where we make mistakes in our teaching of biology. If that comes out, then hopefully we'll have a better understanding of our status in the living organism, that we have to just say we're just another speck in this whole continuum of biodiversity, and we don't have special rights. And forget about the special rights between humans and the rest of the human organisms, between individuals in the population. Lot of things we assume that because we are selected for that particular purpose, so we have a right for certain kinds of professions, certain kinds of opportunities or rights in the society, and we sort of use that to discriminate and oppress others. I think variety of problems of the society get sorted out if you have a better understanding of biology. Next slide, please. So this is another, we keep talking about unity, diversity in India for Indian context, because very extremely diverse human population in terms of cultural diversity, genetic diversity, language diversity, and so forth. Think about how to even present that kind of a unity in diversity. Next slide, please. Now, bacteria to human, the earliest cellular form of bacteria, what is known now from the fossil record, is 3.7 billion year old, right? For 3.7 billion of years, there are millions and millions of species that evolved. Large number of them become extinct. Some of them are still present and continuing. Some of them are continuously becoming extinct now as we speak. But all of them have something common. That common thing is how genetic information is stored, how genetic information is decoded, how genetic information and the environment interact with each other and give rise to a variety of different types of phenotypic diversity. And this unity it's enormous. In fact, people say that, sorry, I forgot to put one picture. The diversity among the biological world, look at just the microbiological world, is so much. There can be two bacterial species that are so different from each other. You'd think that a human and a teak have hardly any differences between the two, right? So let's say if an alien comes and that alien is looking for degree of similarities and difference in the context of the complexity, how the chemical world is organizing itself to give rise to what is life. If that person has that kind of a conceptual understanding, that individual, we don't know what's the first, alien life, if there is one. And if they look at it on the earth, they see that a teak, a tree, or an elephant, or a human, or even a fish or a frog, that person wouldn't even see a difference between the two except some size difference. Whereas that person may see huge difference between two bacterial species, one, let's say an archaea versus eukaryote, eubacteria and so forth. That's the kind of unity we have amongst all the living organisms at the molecular level. And molecular complexity is far, more than what you can imagine. Although what we see the outside is only a phenotypic variation in the complexity, but the molecular variations and molecular complexity is even much more, and part of which is represented as phenotypic, diversity. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll skip this. I don't need to talk about this. Yeah. So again, when you talk about DNA, just go back to the slide, please. All of us will teach molecular biology. How many people who teach molecular biology will connect molecular biology to evolution? There's again, it's always a, particularly in Indian context, people who teach evolution always use the external phenotype, always use some elephants and tigers and plants and trees, right? It could be a grass, it could be an insect, so forth. But when it comes to molecular level, we leave it to the molecular biologist. And molecular biologists never even look at the DNA simply as another genetic material, which is not another, the genetic material which causes all that we understand today in biological system. And most of DNA people when molecular biologists, when they teach DNA replication, they don't connect the DNA replication to the process of evolution, right? So we talk about all these base pairs and all. Next slide, please. We talk about how these base pairs come together, when there is a DNA replication happens, and the new templates are formed. But at the same time, we also see that there can be one or two mistakes, and we use the word mutations. And because the word mutation is a negative meaning, many times it's simply considered as there is some mistake in the DNA replication and just leave it and just pass on to the next chapter in the molecular biology book. But what is important is all that we see today, all we experience in our life is because of these variations. What is taken for granted is that I'm born to another human being as a human being. But what I really experience every day is I'm different from others, right? I'm different from my brother, my sister, and that brother is different from other brothers and sisters, including me, and the whole world is different to each other. But of course, there is unity, and these differences are minor. But that differences are the key for evolution to happen and for life to perpetuate, because the environment is continuously changing. So we never really teach biology in a way that these variations, this once in a while, what happens, so-called base pairing, it's not necessarily pairing, it's some chance which basically brings certain kinds of base pair together and which gets selected, as you see in the next slide. And that happens only when there is a gene environment interaction. Some are selected, some are not selected. What I mean is the frequency of those variations increases or decreases. And that's very important to understand our life, because environment is continuously changing. Unless we have this diversity, we'll not be able to survive long. Human diversity is key for our survival, and not something to be despised of, and not something to be saying that those people are less privileged and we are better, higher privileged, or those are the ones who have uh, in all kinds of discriminatory attitude. But the diversity simply say that everybody individual is different. If every individual is different, every individual, depending on the environmental context, survives in a particular way. And that's what nature is all about, our life is all about, and not that someone is more intelligent, less intelligent, someone is better adapted, or someone is not so well adapted. In a given environment, some many better adapted, some may not be. But in another environment, perhaps it may happen the reverse. In the next slide, this is exactly what happens. We always use these mutations or some genetic variations as diseases and give a very strong, impression about what happens in biological system during DNA replication or during natural selection. Look at this example. All of you know about high hemoglobin, and as one nucleotide change in the 7th codon leads to one amino acid change, will lead to what's called a sickle cell hemoglobin variant. And sickle cell hemoglobin variant is less efficient in oxygen transfer. In individuals which are heterozygous, sorry, okay, I'm almost running out of my time. Almost done, right? And sickle cell hemoglobin variant, when they're in heterozygous, at the higher elevation, of course, they get affected because the oxygen levels are lower, so they show sickle cell anemic phenotype. But at the mean C level, are perfectly normal. And if mean C level, if there is a malaria infection, those individuals are better protected than the so-called normal hemoglobin individuals, because the malarial parasite infects very easily the normal RBCs, not the sickle cell RBCs. So as you can see here, depending on the context, someone is better adapted, someone is not so well adapted. So there is nothing like superior versus inferior here. That's the kind of teaching we should do in biology. And it has a lot of applications, whether you want to do biotechnology, whether you want to do agriculture related to genetic and plant breeding, everywhere. And better understanding of biology from molecules to whole uh, at the ecological scale is very important. Okay, I think I'll skip some of this and go to the next one. I'm almost, yeah. And this is how we should teach the biology, which basically encompasses all that biodiversity that we see today. The next slide, please. Sorry, there was supposed to be a small movie about a cell. Go back to the previous one. So the cell which I'm showing here is basically, again, we teach cell biology as simply as a structure, as part of a life. It's not true. The life, it's the cell itself is the life, right? A multicellular organism is simply nothing but a complex system which has evolved with multiple cells coming together. a unit of cell, what we call cell, is actually the life itself. And there are, even in our body, there are a large number of cells which can happily move around and live on its own, right? And they, don't dictate. They are not dictated by your brain. In fact, they can dictate your brain. Although you consider you as self is based on your conscious self, and your conscious self can be dictated by someone else in your body. And that someone else is certain kinds of cells, may not be your own cell. It could be not necessarily human cell. It could be even a bacterial cell as part of a microbiome. The next cell, please. Sorry, did I say next cell? I'm supposed to say next slide. I'm sort of too much engrossed in cellular form of life. Okay. Finally, this is the last slide. There were a few slides. I'll skip all of that thing in the interest of the time. So, when you teach biology, whether it's for biomedical purposes, for agriculture related purposes, or veterinary biology related purposes, or simply understanding biology, ecology, biodiversity, forest, if someone wants to understand the tiger or someone wants to understand the butterflies or honeybees, it's an organized state of chemical reactions, which has organized in the form of a cell. A cell has its own boundary conditions, and that boundary conditions are very important for maintaining certain kinds of balance between energy which comes in and entropy which builds in, it has to be thrown out. And what is important is the spatial organization of all these chemical reactions inside the cell, and that sort of certain rate in which it diffuses, and that rate is extremely important to make sure that whatever the chemical reaction that happens, it happens at a time scale, which basically creates this physiological state called life. But what is more important from people who want to look at beyond individual cells or beyond individual organisms at the population level or ecological level is the fact that when it makes copies of itself, those copies are not necessarily identical. Every time there are some variations. Those variations, when they interact with the environment, they bring out a new complexity. And because the environment is continuously changing, why it changes? Not necessarily because there is a physical environment which changes. It's the biological entity itself can change the environment. Every time a new organism is born, already some environmental change has happened. And that interaction starts all over again between the environment and the individuals, or what you call genotype. And that's the, a perpetuity of life. And this very essence of this life has to be taught in a proper way across everybody. Everybody should know this. Even ecology should know at the molecular level what happens, and molecular biology people or cellular people or immunologists should also know what happens at the ecological level. And all that thing is should be encompassed, not necessarily in greater detail, but at the conceptual level. And depending on what they want to study in more great detail, whether immunology or nervous system or the cardiovascular system or agriculture or veterinary, they can go in deeper and deeper. But that's only more deeper understanding of something at the molecular and mechanistic level, not necessarily the conceptual level. If you understand, perhaps you go to the last slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next one. Oh, okay. There's one slide before. Yeah. No, not this one. Perhaps one more slide somewhere. Yeah, this one. So if you want to teach biology in a somewhat discrete chapter wise, because it's very difficult for everybody to talk about everything, obviously what are the foundations which every biology student should have is genetics, evolution, biochemistry, cell and molecular biology, and physiology. Physiology is the one which really makes what is life. Biochemistry can happen in the test tube or inside the cell, right? And evolution can also happen, inside a test tube or in a flask. And genetics you can study in this one. But physiology is something which really, what happens in the living system. And that's where finally everything gets connected. I'll stop here and we can have some discussion. Sorry, I took longer than I thought. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shashi. It was really great to hear such a deep take on why we study or teach biology at all. And I hope we continue to have such meaningful conversations about teaching and studying biology in India. Um, Earlier this week, I think Biology was released and launched. And I think many of the authors share the same wonder you have just shared about the subject and about why we should be teaching biology in a meaningful way to students. So I think Biology is an online open access ebook for undergraduate students of biology. It holds about 10 chapters, 4 primers, and the authors have tried to explain biology through case studies based in India to encourage students to really explore biology through an integrative and interdisciplinary manner. So I want to invite two of our authors here today, Professor Shravanti and Kaustubh. Kaustubh Rao is also a professor of biology at APU, and he teaches various courses such as biochemistry and etc. So first, Shravanti will share with us her motivation for developing the book altogether, and soon after that, Kaustubh will share some features of the book with us. Over to you, Shravanti.
Thanks, Nilima. Thanks so much, Shashi, also for getting us started on this discussion. I think one of the things that you said that sort of deeply resonates with my own sort of personal training as a scientist and my experience as an educator is the idea that everything is so interconnected in biology. Going from molecules to ecosystems, and also the idea that evolution, ecology are not separate from things that we study at the cellular or molecular scale, and that if you mess with something at the molecular scale, you're also messing with something at the larger scale, and that sort of broad understanding is really essential. But before I get further into that, I thought that I would start with actually discussing a bit of my personal journey when I joined Azim Premji University, because it's really relevant to the story of how I decided to be part of this project and how we actually decided to start this project in the first place. So it's been 6 years now since I joined the university, and I had really the privilege of being part of a team that built an undergraduate program from scratch in biology. And we were really lucky because we were empowered to really build a program in whatever way we saw fit, and we were able to draw on our past experiences, and we were also in some sense able to correct course through a kind of trial and error process. And one of the things that really struck me when the site, the iThink Biology, went live earlier this week, one of my colleagues in the humanities came to me and said, the the website is really beautiful, it's really visually appealing, and I hope that this gets my son interested in studying biology. He really likes insects, he really likes trees, he really likes birds, but he doesn't like biology. And I found this sort of incredible. I said, but he likes insects and birds and trees. How can you say he doesn't like biology? And I think this really speaks to the state of biology education, right? That a student actually sees the natural world as being separate from the discipline of biology. And that's really, I think that's speaks to how badly we've engaged students in the discipline, and in fact, if anything, it seems like we've disengaged them from the discipline, right? And so I think one of the key challenges for us as a team, I would say, as a group at the university when we started this program, was how do we really engage students and how do we make students see that biology is this very relevant, tangible, and important discipline, right? And of course, the story with my colleague's son is one of so many that we keep hearing all the time about studying biology, right? We don't want to study it because it's all about memory work, it's all about memorizing fact, it's about, having this drawing book and drawing with the, as you said, the how the petals are arranged on a flower. And if you really think deeply about it, what students are complaining about the study of biology is actually that they're not learning anything that they think they will ever use in the future, right? It's not just complaining about the fact that they have to memorize, things, but it's facts, but it's they don't see the relevance of it, for them in the present and in the future. Uh, and so I guess one of the things I would have asked myself, I continue to ask myself, is when they're studying biology, are they really picking up skills that they can apply in their future careers? Or even more simply, are they learning something that they could use in their everyday lives, right? And of course, we know that many students who study biology at the undergraduate level don't necessarily go on to study biology for the rest of their lives, or practice in the discipline per se. So I think the three questions you could ask yourself when you decide to train biology students at the undergraduate level is, first is how do you make this really relevant for the student? And how can you make them learn without having to memorize facts? In other words, what should they be learning and how much should they learn, right? And I think one of the things, Shashi, you said was about making connections across scales and not to learn things, sort of disciplines, as being separate. And finally, what are the skills and capabilities or capacities that you would want a student to develop that they think that could actually be useful to them in the future? So even if they're studying biology now, but they don't study biology later. And so I would say that these three questions about how to make it relevant, what do you actually teach them, what's the content that you should teach them, and what are the sort of skills that they should pick up. This is where we really thought about what I call two C's, but not the third, which is context, capacity, but not content, right? And so how to make it relevant, we felt, was really to have a lot more context for what we teach students. And I mean, by context, I mean actually two different things. One is, of course, most of the educational material that is available to us is really very Western based, and it's drawn on examples from the West, and there is almost nothing that is relatable to the average student in India. While those resources are very appealing, of high production quality, and they're really wonderful resources, there's with much thought to pedagogy, frankly, it doesn't reach most of our students. And I want to bring up an example here of what happened in my class, in a biophysics class that I teach. And recently I was showing a video about how nerve impulses, how neurons fire, basically. And this was an example from a very nice educational resource. And in that video, they showed that a neuron spikes every time this patient hears something about The Simpsons or something about Martin Luther King. And I don't know how many of our audience members are familiar with Martin Luther King or The Simpsons, but I can tell you that at least half of my class had no idea who these people were, right? And it was very clear that half of the class was laughing and the other half of the class had no idea what was happening. And so there was a clear division that I had created by showing this kind of pedagogical material, which is a shame because, of course, what was being shown in the science was extremely interesting and there was a lot of thought put into it. But I felt that rather than creating a sort of inclusive environment, I had created a division in my classroom. And so I think instead, if I had shown something about, I don't know, a Bollywood movie or something that was really Indian, that was much more relevant to my students, it would have been a much more sort of unifying and inclusive way of teaching a concept, right? And not just that, when students, if I had, brought up something about the Western Ghats instead of talking about, I don't know, the Swiss Alps or something like this, those are all things that are familiar to all Indian students, right? And so I think having the Indian context is really important. And it's also important because when you see that there are Indian scientists who are doing excellent work, there's a much higher likelihood that a student sees themselves in that scientist, right? That they can, that there is really nothing inherently different about them that doesn't allow them to do all of this exciting work, right? Then the second C that I wanted to talk about was content. Is what is it that students should be learning without having to memorize facts, right? of course, it's really important for them to learn, and there are some sort of foundational ideas in biology, like you such as evolution, ecology, biodiversity, the tree of life, how are things connected, the central dogma, the ideas of inheritance. All of these foundational ideas are really important. But how do you make content interesting, and how much of it should you include, right? And I think one of the advantages that we have as biology teachers that perhaps other educators in the natural sciences don't, is that biology is actually a very empowering subject. And the reason I say that is because students can make independent discoveries even at the high school level, right? They can do experiments and make inquiries into biological systems, and ask questions about the world that perhaps nobody else in the whole world is asking at that moment. And for me, that's a really exciting way to teach biology, right? You can go out, literally go into your garden, walk on the street, look at observe a stray dog on the street. You can observe how birds are flying. You can look at ants crawling on a mango tree. And these are all things that people at the Azim Premji University are doing with our students. And it's so exciting for students to know that this is the first time that they are, that this kind of study is being done, and that no one else in the world is doing it. So it's really empowering for students, especially for students who are coming from sort of underprivileged backgrounds. They are doing something that no one else has done, and for me, that's really a confidence builder, right? And I think we have all really experienced this while building the program at Azim Premji University. Yeah. And so I think in light of this, putting a lot of thought into balancing how much content you want to put into a biology program, is to really take a close look at, how much depth do you really need, and where is it relevant for a particular stage in higher education, right? How much content should you have at the high school level? And is the student going to go on to study biology? And if not, then if a large percentage of them are not, then what is it that you should be teaching them? How much content should you include? And rather, perhaps a different way of thinking about it is, it's not so much the content that matters, but the capacities that they can build. So are they, building the capacities to learn what is relevant, and can they, independently learn these things without having to be told to memorize, right? And on this note, this kind of way of teaching biology, where you are really giving a student the power to make discoveries, and telling a student that they're doing something that nobody else can do, actually demystifies science, I think. And we've heard this many times from students who come in, say, in their first year, and they're doing experiments, and they realize, in fact, Nilima, who's here today, just told us this when she studied biology at the university, was that you always think of scientists as, being sort of a class or a sort of people that are separate from the rest of society. And once you actually get to do experiments and know that you are doing things that, other people haven't, you realize that, no matter how old or rich or poor you are, or what gender you are, you can be a scientist, whether you're from a village in Haryana or from a village in Kerala, or you're from Bangalore. Being a scientist is possible. Of course, there are barriers to being a scientist, but I think it's important for students to see that there's nothing inherent about themselves that stops them from having say, sort of a scientific way of thinking and doing, right? And I see that as really a very powerful tool as a educator, especially in the context of having such a diverse student population, right? And I think that's really relevant to the Indian context. So the final thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of capacities. So how do you build capacities? How do you build skills in students, whether they go on to study biology or not at the undergraduate level, right? And here, I think we really need to think about what are students going to do once they graduate. And certainly our experience at the university while building this new program was that maybe 50% of students go on to higher education in biology, and probably a much smaller fraction of that number goes on to study even further, right? And so I would argue that specializing at the undergraduate level is not really that useful, but rather, exactly as Shashi said, that it would be much more useful for students to have a much more integrative approach. Yes, learn a little bit about plants, learn a little bit about animals, learn about these things across time and length scales, but equip them so that they can do a deeper study, and learn mostly about how and why to study all of these systems, right? And I think very importantly, especially in light of how the world is today, in light of climate change, learn about how interconnected things in nature are across time and length scales, across ecological systems, right? I think those are the ideas that we should try to bring to the forefront. That's not to take away the importance of every discipline, every sort of sub-discipline, but I think having this kind of integrative approach is extremely useful. And that's certainly what we've learned so far in building this program. And finally, I want to end just sort of to give something for Kaustubh to start on to talk about, I think, biology is, given all of the, what did I say? There's 2 C's, but not the third, which is content, context. Sorry, not content, but context and capacities, which is, while biology is this really empowering subject, it's also very challenging to make teaching resources, because biology, unlike say some of the other natural sciences, is changing so fast. And as Shashi said, before there was Mendelian genetics, but since then there's been so much, right? So much that's been taught. And I think it's really important that students are aware of how fast this is being taught, and having a printed textbook sometimes makes it challenging to keep up with those times, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why we decided to go online, but of course that also comes with some drawbacks, and perhaps Kaustubh will talk about that. And I think to see biology as this integrative subject and not isolated subdisciplines, and to cater to learners but not to teachers. Those were our ideas. That's sort of how we synthesized all of our ideas to build, I think, biology. And I think, Kaustubh, I can let you speak now and take over and talk more specifically about the textbook itself. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Shravanti and Professor Shashidhara, for your very illuminating comments. I'm just going to quickly show some features of the textbook and then perhaps talk about how we made these choices. So could we have the textbook on the screen? Yeah. So one feature of the textbook, which I think decided early on, was to make it very visual. And one of the joys of producing this textbook has been to use students' artwork in the textbook. So we had 2 classes of illustrators. One was our own students, and then one we worked with a professional illustrator, IISER. So all the chapter mastheads have been produced by students, and this is a very beautiful drawing for the chapter on figs. And could we go to the next slide, please? So I think biology, like Nilima and Shravanti have said, is a free online digital resource. It's still in a beta version, and we are waiting for feedback and no doubt corrections from readers, and it will go fully live in the next few months. So this is the masthead, what you see, and we've tried to IISER, the illustrator, took in all our ideas, and then she came up with this concept which shows kind of all the multifarious parts of biology and this human figure kind of contemplating all those features of biology. So if you look at this figure very carefully, you will see multiple life forms, but also different processes of biology. And there's also some clues to some very famous images in there that she's brought in. So it's a very nice abstract figure. And then in the table of contents shows you all the different features of the textbook. So one big departure from other textbooks is that it is organized around themes. We don't really have chapters like evolution or ecology or cell. We've decided to stick with themes for this textbook. And the themes are land and waterscapes, human health, food and agriculture, plants and animals, and the last theme is of primals. And so within each theme, we have specific chapters. So if we look at, say, land and waterscapes, we have a chapter on the Western Ghats. Then we have a chapter on waterscapes, because that is typically not touched upon when we talked about ecology. And then we have a very important landscape which is going to dominate our lives, which is the city. So we have a chapter on urbanscapes within that. So each chapter focuses on some key aspects of that topic within there. Moving on, if we look at one chapter in particular, so for instance, if we look at this chapter which is shown here in malaria, we see that there are several headings within that, right? And so again, to emphasize, we have not tried to kind of, when writing this chapter on malaria, it's not like the complete biology of malaria. We have chosen to highlight specific features of this disease. And so all these features are encapsulated in these headings, where we talk about the history of malaria, because it has a very, very interesting history, and there are several books written about it, fiction and non-fiction. Then there's a chapter on preventing malaria, because there's a huge global effort on trying to do that. And then what are some of the scientific tools that people have used, and what could students learn from that, right? And then each chapter also has a quiz which students can take on their own or in conjunction with their teacher. And then we also have all the references that we have used. And if you look at, so this is, I would say, one of the main features of the textbook that I would like to highlight, which is the capacities that we have tried to develop when writing the textbook. And Shravanti pointed this out, but it bears repeating that unlike typical textbooks which will have content and drive kind of the narrative through that, we have chosen to drive each chapter through the capacities we would like students to develop when they are looking at that chapter. And so as an author, I had to think very hard as to, okay, I'm writing about malaria or I'm writing about cotton, but what is it that I actually want the student to learn when they are reading that, or when they are engaging with some of the questions within that chapter, right? And these are 5 capacities that we finally arrived at, all the authors in our discussion. And it's also based on our experience in teaching in the classroom, right? So one of the standard ones which we would normally engage with is reading and interpreting. And essentially, it might just stop there when we are teaching biology, right? Like students have a textbook or they have a lecture, they read it and you interpret the material, right? But that's only one capacity that we think is important. Apart from that, there are other things, right? There's the capacity of scientific tools and processes, right? So what are some of the tools and techniques that biologists use to answer these questions, right? We never tend to talk about that. We just say when you're talking about developmental biology, you would show a fly and you might talk about Hox's genes, but you never actually talk about how those experiments were done, right? So we have tried to focus on key experiments and, you know, try to get students to engage with, okay, how do you ask questions and how do you go about answering them? Then the third capacity we have is that of the scientific process, where we have tried to highlight that the scientific process is not linear, right? It takes many jumps across space and time, right? And there are many actors, and they make their contributions, and finally you arrive at an answer, and then the journey continues. So that's really what we would like students to take away from that. We also have the capacity of quantitative skills. I think pretty much everybody here knows that no longer can you teach biology without students learning maths and trying to interpret graphs. Statistics is a major part of biology now. And so it's really important that students learn basic quantitative skills, and we've chosen to focus on that. And finally, I would say one of the more important capacities is the context aspect that Shanti highlighted, which is what is the context in which a particular field developed. So how did the field of malaria develop? How did people go about trying to discover the parasite, or what is the cause of malaria, right? And what is the impact that it's had on our society or on the environment, right? So trying to put science in the context of where we are now, and then see if it makes sense to the student, right? So this I would say is really the heart of the textbook. Could we go on to the next slide? Another aspect that we've chosen to work with is that of the case study. So it's really not we've tried to use examples wherever possible. And so this is an example from the chapter on Western Ghats, where there was a case study of whether windmills affect organisms in their vicinity. And so this is a case study of bird predation on lizards and how windmills may or may not affect it. And so we have chosen to take different aspects of this case study and use it to show students how is the scientific process developed, right? How do you generate a hypothesis? How do you design a study? And after your study is designed and you run your experiments, how do you interpret your results? And so each chapter will have a particular case study. And of course, we've chosen to highlight case studies which have an Indian context so that there's an immediate connect for the student. So after which we can look at a different aspect of the textbook where, it's really important as a learner to stop once in a while and ask yourself, okay, what is it that I have learned just now? Okay, so in a lecture mode, we try and do that, right? We stop and say, okay, where are we now? What have you understood now? So, but if you are engaging with the textbook on your own, these critical thinking questions are meant to allow you to do that, right? So, okay, you've read something, or you've seen a graph, or you've studied an image. What have you understood from that, right? So we've put in these critical thinking questions wherever possible. And it was really a lot of fun trying to come up with some of these questions and think of what could be possible answers to these questions. And the other one is a more standard thing which you would find in another textbook, where we have exercises in the chapter. So there could be a quantitative exercise, or it could be an exercise where you're actually asked to do something. For instance, here it talks about, this is an exercise related to the case study on windmills, and it asks you, what have you noticed when you read that case study, right? So these in-chapter exercises are again something that the student could do on their own, or a teacher could guide them when they do it. Next, after that, we have exercises again where we've tried to use Indian case studies, but it's focusing more on quantitative skills, again to try and drive home the point that biology is no longer, it's not been descriptive for a very long time now, but that fact hasn't really filtered into our textbooks, right? And it is a quantitative science for all practical purposes. There's a lot of modeling that goes on in biology. There is a lot of theoretical understanding which drives biology, right? So we've chosen to use quantitative exercises to allow the student to do that. So there's a lot of data interpretation, there's a lot of graph interpretation in all the different chapters. And again, the student can do this on their own, really, and see how much understanding they've gained from reading a particular chapter. After which, we have, in our teaching, we've used research papers quite a bit. We've looked at primary literature quite a bit, and we've seen how it benefits the student. Initially there's a reaction from the student saying, "Oh my God, how in the world am I ever going to understand this?" But you try and break down a scientific paper and figure out, okay, what is this paper about, right? And then finally, at the end of this exercise, which can last for a week or longer, we see how much it benefits the student, right? And the student really, the reactions that we've got is that, "Oh, you know what? I felt I could never do this, but now once we've gone through this process, it's really kind of engaged me more with the subject." So we've chosen to use primary literature. And so in each chapter, there is a paper that we have chosen. And we have broken down the paper by giving annotations where possible. We've tried to be very selective in our annotations because that also kind of impedes the reading. But where possible, we've tried to highlight unique aspects where students or teachers should pay attention to what has been written. And again, we have used research from within India so that students really become accustomed to reading papers from India and finding out like the huge variety of work which is going on in India, quite exciting work which has been going on in India for a long time. And so this is a unique aspect of the book that I think students will really enjoy. After which, another, I think, aspect which is part of that bridging science and society is that we have interviews with scientists, with practitioners who have chosen to tell us how they've gone about looking at a particular problem. So the interview highlights two aspects. One is the scientific aspect of a particular chapter. So here we see interviews with Gagandeep Khan or Nachiket Kerkar or Beena, who's a faculty at APU. And in each of these interviews, they talk about their own research work, how they've tackled problems, or what are some of the unique aspects of their work. And then there are also questions dealing with being a scientist. How is science perceived in India? How did they go about tackling, impediments to their own research? And what are some of the benefits of doing that? So these interviews with scientists are really great. I've really enjoyed looking at them, and I would encourage people to look at some of these interviews and really a very big learning experience from the textbook. So I think these are some of the features of the textbook. I would really encourage readers to look at it in great depth. I think we've done a lot of thinking around it, but now it's time to find out whether it actually works or not. And we would love feedback from anybody and everybody about it. So,
thank you so much, Kaustubh
It was
and
a
Shravanti,
fantastic.
for
No, I just want to say that it's a fantastic initiative and it's a mammoth exercise, and I'm sure it's going to be successful. Well designed and thought of how to go about, and I'm sure it get improvised and more people use it, and then provide comments to how to further improve on it. Illustrations are fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shashi and Kaustubh and Shravanti, for introducing the book to us. Like Professor Shashi said, we hope that iThink Bio continues to evolve, and we'd be happy to hear from students, teachers who work with biology. And please leave your comments and questions in the chat box. We have a few more minutes to answer any questions that the audience might have. I think I've already seen a few questions, and so please continue to share your questions. So the first question, Professor Shashi, maybe you could answer this. In India, why does no one teach theory of intelligent design in biology classes, or how life originated on Earth? This is a question from the audience.
Okay, intelligent design to start with, it's not something which is part of the scientific, literature or the curriculum that evolved over time. Particularly at undergraduate level, for more than 150 years of undergraduate formal education, starting from Western European countries to now. It is came as a protest against Darwinian theory of evolution in American schools and colleges, not schools, not even colleges, that it should also be taught as an alternate version, because it's an argument that Darwinian theory of evolution is just one form of explanation about life. There may be an alternate explanation. We should talk about it. But that alternate explanation, internet design, it's simply a theology, right? And we do not have such a dogmatic view of life. So we don't need really, have felt that need in Indian context, because students can, formulate their own ideas and opinions based on the, what they hear in the society and what they hear, read from the scientific literature. Now, coming to the second part of the question is is about the origin of life. Origin of life is not so much, is simply because we don't know enough. That's one of the least known topic in biology. The two least known is origin of life, and another one is the to some extent, although human cognition, neuroscience is so well understood, human languages and all, some aspect of cognition and consciousness is also less known compared to what we know about our heart or liver. Our brain is somewhat least understood, right? These are the areas which is still evolving and emerging out. So it's too early to start getting deeper into deeper, because what we teach today may not be relevant tomorrow. Some new concept may emerge. So that's one of the reasons why they are not yet in the textbooks.
Thank you. Kaustubh, maybe you can take the next question. Kaustubh teaches Understanding India at APU, which is a core course that students of all disciplines take. So whether you're a bio student, an economics student, Understanding India is a course that everyone takes. So this question is, can you shed more light on the topic of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to teaching biology? Will the national education policy help bridge this requirement?
Thanks, Nilima. Well, I should mention I teach Understanding India 1, along with a whole host of other faculty members. And in the next term, students do Understanding India 2, so it's a kind of series of 2 courses. Regarding a multidisciplinary approach, I think Professor Shashidhara's entire talk was actually about that, if I'm not mistaken, and he was advocating, I think all the speakers here would be strong proponents of multidisciplinary approach, and I think all of us use that in our teaching, right? So currently I'm teaching a course on molecular biology or rather I'm teaching a course in biochemistry, and we're talking about metabolism. So, some students are going to do a whole, there's a group assignment on looking at metabolic syndrome in India. And so that's, not just related to the biology of it, but you have to bring in food, nutrition, lifestyle. Basically, what is the connection between something you've learned in the class and your personal life and life in the larger public sphere? So I think pretty much every topic in biology lends itself to that, and everybody, I think, understands it and is trying to do it. I don't know if the 2 other speakers would like to say something else, something more.
No, I think you added, you answered it well. I think, when we talk about, let's say, quantitative skills, you simply want to teach genetics at population level, connecting to evolution. I think it's already becoming interdisciplinarity. Without bringing in some, mathematics, some aspect of chemistry, you cannot teach biology these days, right? So obviously interdisciplinarity is the key. And in fact, so-called multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity itself is sort of, moving away those terminology, because, integrated biology is all about, biology, but it may use some physical terms or chemical terms or mathematical terms. Finally, it's biology.
Thank you. I think the next question, yeah, Shravanti?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I guess the question was also about the multidisciplinarity and if the new education policy would help facilitate that. And I think overall the answer would be yes, because we get now we will have 4 years for an undergraduate program, and that will perhaps allow us a little bit more room to still have sufficient depth in the discipline, but then also have a little bit more breadth so that a student could, if they were studying biology, they could still take a few courses in, I don't know, physics, math, and even in some humanities courses that might be relevant. So, for example, if a student was interested in public health, of course, there are many courses in the humanities that would be extremely relevant to those interests. So, I think broadly the answer is yes. I think the NEP would help with that. Yeah.
I think the next question is specific to, I think, biology. Wondering if you had any student input in choosing the case studies. How did you find the student engagement response? Do they connect to the case studies as much as you expected? Shravanti, maybe you can take this one, or Kaustubh.
Okay. Actually, I would say, sadly, no, we did not really take direct student input about which topics to use. I think that was because we chose, for example, we chose malaria because we felt it lent itself to specific capacity building. So, for example, we wanted them you know to have this basic skill of to know how a microscope works, like just a light compound microscope. And so we felt that malaria would be a good topic to cover, because we could talk about how malaria is diagnosed, and in that we could sneak in some content that we thought would be relevant, which is how a microscope works. And so those were the kind of scientific tools that we felt would be important. And the reason it's been launched as a beta version is also because we actually want to take in a lot more student input before we remove the beta tag from it. And we're hoping that we get input not just from students at Azim Premji University, but also from students in colleges across the country. And so it would be nice to be able to reach as many people as possible, because no matter how much we think we are reaching out to people, we're all in our own bubbles, right? So it'd be really nice to be able to cater to a very diverse audience. Having said that, whatever preliminary feedback we've gotten, students have said that it's a lot more accessible and easier to understand. And of course, everyone really likes the illustrations, thanks to IPSA. So I think that has really drawn in a lot of people. So, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe Professor Shashi, you can take the next question. Um, to make science education more relevant for all students, what fundamental transformations are required at the curriculum and teacher training level?
Yeah, so I think my first or second slide was related to science education, but particularly at the school level, we need to ensure that teachers understand and they teach and make students understand that science is about understanding the natural world or even to the human world, but not based on our intuition, not based on our opinion, not based on our personal observations. Even if you make observation, which is extremely important, even if you do an experiment, which is extremely important, but your experiments or your observations should be subjected to validation, because there can be mistakes, or simply, you know, your there is a certain limitation to our making observations, because as the best example is the earth revolving around the sun. No one has seen it among the 7 billion people, And if you go on saying that, okay, one way of validation is keep on asking other people, right? Is it true? Is it true? Is it true? Everybody will say, yes, 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 the sun is moving around us. Start from the east and sets in the dawn. Even after 7 billion people seeing it, could be something wrong, or the truth could be something alternate. So this understanding of science is very important. To impart this understanding, you need to use experiments, you use a variety of different others techniques in the schools and the colleges. It could be activity based, it could be game based, or it could be using some digital resources. Very importantly, hands-on activities, which is sometimes very difficult at the school level. At least in undergraduate level, we should definitely introduce.
Thank you. I think the next one is more of...
Sorry, Nilima, could I just quickly add something to what Professor Shashidhara said? I think one thing I would like to say is, that science, the last point that Professor Shashidhara said, which is that science is an active mode of inquiry, right? So it's really important for a transformational educative process to occur that teachers kind of take their students out, and biology in particular is about the science of living things, right? It's not in the textbook. You have to go outside and look at things, and I think pretty much every school will have either a small garden or a park nearby, or maybe teachers can make an effort and organize a trip, but it's really important to go outside, I would say, particularly in the study of biology. I think it's also true for physics and chemistry, but particularly for biology. So it's not in the textbook, I would say.
Thank you. I think maybe the next one is more of a comment and not a question. But integration of subfields in biology is important and relevant. But in the process, we have neglected classical fields within biology. We now have a generation of biology students who have no exposure to animal, microbe, or plant classification. So this is, I think, a comment, but would anyone like to quickly respond to it? Kaustubh, maybe?
Well, I would say that we have not ignored that. They should read the chapter on rice. There's a whole section on classification using rice as an example. So, and how that's done. So, we have also thought that it is important, and phylogenetics and systemics. So there is a whole example of that in the chapter on rice.
Yes. There's one last question I don't see.
Sorry, Nilima, can I just add one thing? So I do take the point about, I was just reading the comment, and I think it's absolutely true that this vanishing field of taxonomy, it's really a shame that taxonomy is vanishing. But I think it also needs to adapt to the way that biology is evolving. And that's not to say that we should ignore it. I think it's nor should we ever put it down, because I think classification has been such an important tool in understanding the natural world. And as Hema says, that that we really, and also as Kaustubh said, it really is important for us to take notice of the wealth of information and knowledge that's been gained through taxonomic studies, whether it's in our museums or natural history collections, or through observation of the natural world. And I think that we have tried to actually not ignore that point at all in the chapters. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shravanti. I think we've gone a little over our time slot. So I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Professor Shashi, once again for being here and speaking to us and supporting the book in every way.
Thank you. Thanks for giving this opportunity. I really, enjoy talking to all of you. And it is something which we all learn. It's a continuous process of learning. And even if we say we have understood biology and so we want to teach biology to others, I think there's so much for all of us to learn. So in a way, while teaching, we learn better. But my understanding of biology became more, sort of with better clarity and sort of improved only when I started undergraduate teaching. Even as a researcher, having published so many papers, I think my understanding of biology was very poor. It was still, some molecules here and there, not biology.
Thank you. And thank you,
Thank
Kaustubh and
you.
Shravanti.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
also introducing the book.
Bye.
And we hope to hear more from the audience, from readers, from teachers and students. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye, Kaustubh.